arrived at the premium storage facility. So this time, I figured I'd do a Q&A session on this. And this is going to be a bit of a Q&A and M. As you can see, we left off, well, we're picking up where we left off when we parked this after the last wheeling trip last year. As usual, it sits for extended periods of time in between usage, and we just fire it up when duty calls. Now I got to make sure there's no hornets or wasps in it this time, because it's a little bit later in the year. Now surprisingly, last time we had a problem with the left front tire. It always loses air and goes flat over time. And one of the patches internal to the tire actually ended up leaking. It was in the sidewall, so we actually threw some more tire plugs in it just to get us by. Sure enough, I think that might have fixed the leak. It hasn't gone flat yet. Glad to see it's still holding there. So I tried to ask anybody for their questions they had for this. I think one person had the legit question, and I can't answer it because I don't have a tape measure to see what the wheelbase is. I'm pretty sure it's the stock wheelbase. For what it was, we will check. However, at one point it had an extended wheelbase because this thing had a non-driven tag axle back here for hauling lots of firewood, so that would have been quite the setup. So I'll make some of my own questions. And you know, these are things that I know people have asked in the past. Common thing is, when's the last time I changed the oil? Well, I've changed it one time, and that was like a year after we got it going for the first time, which means this oil is probably now about 8 years old in it. But it's probably only got 100 miles on it, so it's still good, right? Another question is, how fresh is the fuel? And the answer is not very. I've never drained the tank, although it's sort of self-draining if you fill it up over halfway because there's a rust hole in it. But I've never changed the diesel, never flushed it. Only thing I've ever done is just add to it. So it gets what it gets. Next question of storage. And as you can see, this is what it gets. Parked next to some trees and good enough. Another question is, why would you let this thing sit out here and rot? Well, I would dispute the fact that it's rotting. Just like wine, it's aging. It's getting better with age. And it's hard to see these, Landcruisers now. I can't believe how much money, nice ones are bringing. And many years ago, this thing would have, basically been considered scrap. It needs a lot of repairs, a lot of rust damage. It's been heavily modified, of course, so, wouldn't think too much of it. And over the years, just keeping it going, I think, is maintenance and preservation on it. It just sits around waiting for the time to get put back into service and used. And, it gets some fluids maintained here and there, and just running it helps keep it going. So even though it's just sitting around outside, I mean, it's not being abused unnecessarily. It's basically just doing what it would normally be doing, chilling. What axle options do we have? Well, these are the stock Landcruiser axles, front and rear. In the back, it's got welded spider gears, and in the front, it's still open, which is good because manual steering with 38.5-inch swampers would be even more tiring with a locked front end. Another question is, will this thing ever see the road again? That's an interesting question because I don't know. I wouldn't rule it out. However, the amount of work that this thing would need to actually make it road legal again is quite substantial. And for its current, usage, it serves the purpose well, being an off-road rig, zombie apocalypse type deal. Always got to have that in reserve. And from what I remember hearing about when this thing was on the road, it wasn't that great handling to begin with. So, I think it does better off the pavement. So another question is, am I ever going to fix this up? Do I own this? No, this is not my Landcruiser. It's a buddy of mine. However, ever since I've kind of fixed it up and gotten it going, it's been my quote-unquote dedicated trail rig for when I'm over at this place hanging out on vacation. So I'm the primary one that uses it, keeps it going, supplies it with you know, some care and maintenance when it needs it. So I like to think I help out in keeping this thing alive, but no, I have no plans of actually fixing it up too much more. It's sort of my style as it is, you know, rough around the edges. And it seems to do its job well right now, which is, you know, supplying some good times wheeling off-road. Another question is, what is the most surprising thing about this whole rig? And my answer to that would be the brakes. Because when this thing was sitting in its resting place for, you know, 13 years, it was sunken in to the point that the rear axle was literally filled with water. So the rear axle was underwater, the brakes were underwater, just sitting there. The brakes on this thing, I have never touched them, okay? We've never tried to unbind anything. There hasn't been any leaks, knock on wood. The rear drums are somehow still sort of functioning and free. The, you know, master cylinder's got a little bit of air in it and you have to pump it sometimes, but everything still works, which just blows me away. I mean, I know brakes are overrated because they just slow you down, but sometimes if you're going down a steep descent, they are nice to have. As a side note, the clutch master cylinder used to leak quite a bit, and it still does when you use it, but every year it would be empty. Well, the more I've used this, the better that's gotten, and it actually doesn't even leak out now when you leave it sitting here. Do you ever clean it out? That's a definite no. How many things are living inside of this? I would say there's at least a couple of mice. No current wasp nests, so that's good. And about 30 dozen mosquitoes. Another question is, how much does it weigh? A lot, but diamond plate is not light, and there's a lot of it. I mean, the bumper and the frame repairs and stuff are also substantial, so there's a lot of steel in this thing rolling around, and you can definitely tell by the body roll when you're kind of going over stuff. It's got some weight to it. Yeah, feel free to ask me any more questions. What is the secret to this thing's longevity? I would say most certainly the keychain. Well, I'm going to ask a question now. How many of these were made? I guess this was a BJ42, and I know they're more popular elsewhere, certainly not in the States. I don't know if they were ever sold new there. Interesting to know. I wonder how many of these were actually made.